Okay, a brief run through the philosophical fragments of Søren Kierkegaard, or Kierkegaard, if you want to be precise. The principal ideas advanced in it are that men can be separated into three groups depending on the values they hold. The aesthetes want entertainment, pleasure, and freedom from boredom. Ethical men live for the sake of duty, taking on obligations in order to be bound to discharge them. And religious men live in order to obey God. The Socratic idea of religious truth is that truth in religious matters is not unique, that one learns religious truths by recollection of what one has learned in the realm of ideas. The alternative position, the Christian view, is that God, in time, which is Jesus Christ, is the teacher of men, that faith is an organ of knowing, that knowledge comes through the consciousness of sin, and that in a moment of decision, a man's life can be changed. Kierkegaard's philosophical fragments is the central work in a series of books which are marked by a consistent theme, a most unusual manner of presentation, pervasive irony, a single-minded attempt to present Christianity in a fashion that requires the reader to reach some sort of decision about it. The irony of Kierkegaard is evident even in the title of the book, Philosophical Fragments. Very few philosophers would entitle their main work a fragment or try to present in less than 100 pages the core of their position. In order to read Kierkegaard with some degree of understanding, it is necessary, for most readers at any rate, to have some knowledge of the general plan of his literary work. One of the essential features of his philosophical position is the doctrine of the stages. Kierkegaard believed that men can be separated into three groups depending on what values they hold as fundamental. He calls these three groups aesthetes, ethicists, and religionists. The aesthete is a person who lives for the interesting. He wants entertainment and variety in his life. He seeks to avoid boredom as the worst evil that can overtake him. He lives to find immediate satisfactions. He avoids making any long-term commitments. All men have the aesthetic as the basic material of their lives. Many remain in the aesthetic stage throughout their lives. But most men move into another sphere, the ethical. The ethicist lives for the sake of doing his duty. He replaces the interesting versus the boring with the good versus the bad. The kind of man Immanuel Kant had in mind when he urged us to do our duties rather than follow our inclinations is the kind of man Kierkegaard calls the ethical man. The ethicist's life is successful if he takes on as many obligations to other men as possible and does his best to discharge these obligations. Kierkegaard contrasted the ethical man with the aesthete in his first book, Either Or, of 1843. By posing the question of love and marriage. The aesthete falls in love, lives for a multitude of engagements, but no marriages, wants romance in the Hollywood sense. The ethical man does not fall in love, but rather chooses to love, wants a short engagement so that he may enter the state of being married and thereby become duty-bound to no other person for the remainder of his days, and finds his romance in the daily routine rather than in secret passionate moments. A great many persons with this kind of ethical concern base the ethical rules which govern their lives in God's will. For such persons there is no difference between being ethical and being religious. However, Kierkegaard felt that the Christian religion demanded a different orientation from that which characterizes the ethical man. Kierkegaard did not believe that the Christian concept of sin could be explained by saying that to sin is to break an ethical rule. Sin is not violation of rule, but violation of the person of God. Kierkegaard contrasted the ethical man's orientation with the religious man's orientation in his book Fear and Trembling of 1843, where he considered the problems arising out of Abraham's intended sacrifice of his son Isaac. As Kierkegaard saw it, Abraham had to choose between the ethical demand to avoid murder and the religious command from God that he sacrifice his son. Kierkegaard raised the question whether it might not be the case that religious commitment sometimes requires a man to suspend his ethical concern. The religious man may at times face the temptation to be good rather than holy. Such is the doctrine of the stages in Kierkegaard's philosophy. There is one other feature of Kierkegaard's writing that should be pointed out before considering philosophical fragments in more detail. It is the technique that Kierkegaard called indirect communication. Considerable time might be spent elaborating it, but for the present purpose it will be sufficient to point out that the technique implied that the doctrine of the stages should not be stated directly. The representative of the various stages should not be described from the point of view of an external observer, but presented from within, so to speak. To this end, Kierkegaard often adopted pseudonyms in his books. He felt he could best present the aesthetic stage by imagining an aesthete, then writing out what such an aesthetic man would say. Either or, for example, is an extended correspondence between a young man and his older friend, Judge Wilhelm. Kierkegaard does not directly enter the picture at all, and he offers no judgment between the two views of life presented by the young man and the judge. The reader is left to decide. Kierkegaard was quite successful in this matter, even presenting the imaginary characters with different writing styles. The young man writes beautifully, is poetic, sensitive and lyrical. The judge writes in a pedestrian style, lecturing as he goes, paying little attention to literary graces. The pseudonymous author of the Fragments is Johannes Climacus, one who is writing about something which is at the climax of the total problem that concerned Kierkegaard throughout his entire literary and philosophical production. Climacus is detached, ironic, and supposedly uncommitted on the immediate problem he is considering, namely the possibility of giving a different view of religious truth from that presented by Socrates. Socrates is used in the book as a foil, as a man holding a position against which an alternative view can be seen more sharply. Christianity, as Kierkegaard understood it, is the alternative, of course, but although the reader understands this quite early in the book, the position is not called Christianity until the last paragraph of the book. The Socratic position which Climacus assumes in the book is a rather common interpretation of the Socrates of Plato's dialogues. It may be put briefly as follows. Truth in religious matters does not differ from other kinds of truth. The point of religion is to hold true beliefs about God and to act in accordance with them. Coming to hold true beliefs in religion as in other areas of human concern is essentially a matter of recollection, of remembering what a man knew in the realm of the ideas before birth but forgot when the soul was imprisoned in the body. The teacher in this case does not introduce anything new to the learner, but merely serves as a midwife, helping the learner to recall what he once knew. After the recollection occurs, the learner adjusts to the true propositions, and the teacher drops out of the knowing relation. The teacher is an occasion, but not a condition for knowing. The essential elements in the Christian alternative position regarding religious truth are set forth quite openly by Kierkegaard's pseudonym in the Moral, which he appends to the Fragments. The Christian hypothesis, as Climacus calls it, differs from the Socratic position, as I've already sketched, in assuming faith as an organ of knowing, in presupposing that there can be in men a consciousness of sin, in supposing that there can be a moment of decision which changes the course of a man's life, and in assuming a different kind of teacher from Socrates, namely, God in time, that is Jesus Christ. The detachment of Climacus can be seen in the fact that he states these new assumptions so clearly in this moral, thus enabling the reader to reject Christianity simply and yet with understanding, if he so desires. Furthermore, Climacus merely states that the hypothesis he has been elaborating differs from Socrates' position in these respects. The question of which hypothesis is true is an entirely different question, he says, and he makes no effort to settle this latter question. Now, if Socrates is right, Climacus argues, the truth is within man. The teacher merely helps the pupil to realize what he had known all along. In such a case, a man is in the truth rather than in error. In addition, the teacher is not important, since he does not remove the learner from error, nor does he introduce him to new truth. Further, the time at which a learner recalls the truth is not important. All in all, the situation is similar to what happened with most, if not all, of us when we learned the basic elements of arithmetic. We can no longer remember who taught them to us or when we were taught. The important thing is that 2 and 2 make 4, and they always have and always will. The alternative to this view obviously involves assuming that man is not naturally in the truth, but is naturally in error. If this is the case, then the teacher must first give the learner the condition for leaving error and apprehending truth. Then the teacher must provide the truth for the learner to apprehend. The moment at which the learner leaves error and apprehends truth is now quite important and decisive for the learner. And the teacher must be more than an ordinary man, since he is essential to the learner's apprehension of the truth. Indeed, the teacher is so crucial that he is even necessary in order that the learner may recognize that he is in error. Such a teacher, Climacus says, we could appropriately call Saviour. These elements in Climacus' alternative hypothesis are obviously elements in the traditional Christian account. The fact that one is naturally in error rather than in the truth, and also that one does not even recognize such a condition, clearly refers to the Christian doctrine of sin, and Climacus does call being in error sin. The truth that one gains from the teacher is just as obviously the faith that Christians possess. The very unusual teacher who is essential in coming into the truth is, as Climacus calls him, God in time, that is, Jesus of Nazareth. And the crucial moment in which a man leaves error or truth is the conversion experience that is the object of so much preaching in the Christian churches. Climacus leaves no doubt that these identifications are appropriate, since he often speaks to the reader about what he has written, citing the original sources of the hypotheses he is developing. In outline, then, the account in the Fragments is a very familiar one, differing from the usual Christian account only in the words used to express it and in the reference to the Socratic alternative. There are, however, some implications of Climacus' simple account which are deserving of further treatment. Two matters should be looked into further here. Climacus' account of the absolute paradox and the question of the disciple at second hand. The absolute paradox is a discussion of the philosophical significance of the Christian claim that God was incarnate in Jesus of Nazareth. One of the implications of the Socratic view, that the truth is somehow within man and needs only to be drawn out by a skillful teacher such as Socrates, is that the human mind is adequate for knowing the truth, even religious truth. If, on the contrary, a man does not have the truth within himself or in some sense, then what a man ought to know or needs to know is beyond man himself. It is the unknown, or as Climacus calls it, it is the other, the absolute other. But if it is the absolute other than man's reason is not competent to know it. Yet man, if he is to achieve the truth, must come to know this absolutely other. To this end, so Christians hold, God, the absolutely other, became incarnate in man, that is to say, the absolutely other became not absolutely other. This requires us to say then that the unknown God is both absolutely other and not absolutely other than man, and this statement clearly has the form of a self-contradiction. One of the senses of the word paradox is such that a paradox is an apparent contradiction which is seen on examination not to be a contradiction. Thus it is paradoxical to say of a certain member of a group who is very talkative that he says less than anyone else in the group. Here at first glance it looks as if we are saying that the person both talks a great deal and does not talk a great deal, but the puzzle is resolved quickly when attention is called to the way the words talk and say are used. Namely, although he talks a great deal, he says very little. Most of his talk is insignificant, it is idle chatter. Such a paradox then can be resolved by making some kind of distinction between the apparently incompatible predicates. In saying that his paradox is absolute, however, Climacus seems to be saying that it cannot be resolved. The reason the paradox cannot be resolved lies in the uniqueness of the particular paradox in question. It is essential to Climacus' paradox that the word absolutely be included. God both is and is not absolutely other than man. If we said of Jones that he is other and not other than Smith, we could go on to specify the similarities and differences between the two men. Both are philosophers, but one is interested only in logic, while the other is interested only in ethics. They are alike, yet they differ. But if Jones were said to be absolutely other than Smith, then no comparisons could be made at all. When we use the expression totally different in ordinary speech, we usually mean to emphasize strongly a difference which is really only partial. We mean that two things differ fundamentally in some but not all respects. But Climacus is using absolutely other in a rather strict way, and this means that even to express the total difference is to go beyond the strict limits of language and understanding. Strictly speaking, we cannot even mention a total difference between two things. The very mention of them indicates at least one respect in which they are not totally different, namely, they are alike in that they can be talked about. If this is the case, however, that God or the unknown is both totally like and totally unlike man, and yet that we should not even be able to state this, then the paradox Climacus is expressing cannot be resolved. It cannot be resolved because the very language of this paradox, in one sense at least, does not have meaning. The paradox is absolute. Yet we must express ourselves, or at least Christian men feel that they must express themselves. There is an urge in men, Climacus feels, which drives them to try to express the inexpressible. Reason, Climacus says, seeks its own downfall. To come at this point in a somewhat different way, most men can remember trying to express the uniqueness of their beloved in a language which has its power in virtue of expressing the common features, the repeatable elements, the universally instant qualities of experience. We try to express the unique in terms of the common, and the result is often the paradoxical or the trite. That is why the modern suburbanites... What a time to get a phone call when I'm talking about the absolute other. Oh well, anyway, where was I? I've forgotten. Well, I'll start from somewhere anyway. Let's see. This is a good place to restart. Reason, Climacus says, seeks its own downfall. To come at this point in a somewhat different way, most men can remember trying to express the uniqueness of their beloved in a language which has its power in virtue of expressing the common features, the repeatable elements, the universally instant qualities of experience. We try to express the unique in terms of the common, and the result is often the paradoxical or the trite. This is why the modern suburbanite calling his wife honey is at once so full of significance for him, and yet so trite to his neighbours. If Christianity is true, then its central claim that God was incarnate in Jesus of Nazareth, its central claim leads to a paradox which cannot be resolved as the paradoxes usually are. But there is also another sense of the word paradox which is involved in the discussion in the Fragments. Another meaning of the word, its etymological meaning, is contrary to the received opinion. The absolute paradox is paradoxical also in this sense, and this leads to another point Climacus makes in connection with the paradox. Climacus' discussion of the absolute paradox is followed by a section in which he claims that man's response to the paradox is to be offended. The religious man, when he has passed through the moment and has changed from being in error to being in the truth, to having faith, has his ordinary value commitments upset. Some of Jesus' remarks, at least as they are reported to us in the Christian scriptures, surely run counter to the prevailing values of everyday life. Common sense Perhaps we have a sample of it in Polonius' advice to his son Laertes in Shakespeare's Hamlet. This above all, to thine own self be true. This surely does not suggest that we turn the other cheek when a man strikes us, nor does it agree that the meek shall inherit the earth. What men usually adopt as a pattern for life is in conflict with the pattern set forth in the Christian Gospels. Men usually want success rather than peace, in the Christian sense, and so the Christian recommendation, based on its being a revelation from a transcendent God, offends man. Why should one love his neighbour rather than himself? Why should one love his neighbour rather than sell to him at a profit? That's better. Because God says so. But this recommendation is unreasonable. True enough, but who is to say that God is unreasonable? Did not God reveal himself in a most unexpected way, namely as the apparent illegitimate son of a poor Nazarene woman, born outside wedlock and in the ancient equivalent of a garage? The Christian account is so contrary to the received opinion of what is real value, that it offends the hearer. Such is Climacus' observation. Another consequence of the Christian account is that if God revealed himself to Jesus in Jesus of Nazareth, then it seems he gave special advantages to those men who were contemporary with Jesus and knew Jesus personally, advantages which are denied to the rest of us who are not contemporaries of Jesus. Climacus argues that the immediate followers of Jesus, the contemporary disciples, enjoyed no advantage over the non-contemporary, the disciple at second hand. The paradox is the key to Climacus' position here. What the contemporary saw was not God, but the man Jesus. It was not apparent or obvious to a normal observer that Jesus is or was more than simply a good man. The divinity which Christians attribute to Jesus was not evident to the senses, but represented an additional characteristic about Jesus, which men recognized only in the light of what traditionally has been called the gift of grace from God. Men did not naturally look at Jesus and see his divinity. They beheld only his manhood. Only if God granted grace to the observer did the observer see the divinity of Jesus. Again, using the traditional Christian terminology, we can say that even the apostles could not recognize the divinity of Jesus without having been enlightened by the Holy Spirit. Thus the contemporary disciple enjoyed no advantage over the disciple at second hand, insofar as Jesus' divinity is concerned. The only advantage the contemporary enjoyed concerns Jesus' manhood, his historical existence. Indeed, if there is any advantage, it is the advantage which the disciple at second hand enjoys in having the testimony of several generations that the man Jesus is also God. The reiteration of this claim brings it home as a possibility in a way that the contemporary disciple did not experience. Such then is the position set forth by Kierkegaard through the pseudonym Johannes Climacus in the philosophical Fragments. It is what is at the heart of the religious existentialism position Kierkegaard gave the name to. The position is elaborated by the same pseudonym in a much longer and more involved book, the concluding unscientific postscript to the philosophical Fragments, which runs to 550 pages as compared to the 93 pages of the Fragments. and in which actually there's a lot of critique of Hegel, so I suppose I should discuss it at some point. The Fragments, yes. It is stated clearly and succinctly in the Fragments as a hypothesis. In the postscript, an attempt is made to discuss what would happen to a sophisticated person were he to attempt to put into operation in his own life what is discussed merely as a possibility in the Fragments. In the concluding unscientific postscript to the philosophical Fragments, Climacus concerns himself with the personal question, how do I become a Christian? But the postscript depends upon the Fragments, and the Fragments is really the central statement of Kierkegaard's position. Rarely does one find such an important question as the philosophical account of Christianity stated with the precision, clarity and wit which Kierkegaard exhibits in the Fragments. Kierkegaard was possessed of a keen intellect, a logical passion, and an ability to give expression to one of the most significant alternatives in Western civilization in a manner that retains the kernel of Christianity, yet makes possible its discussion in the modern milieu. To have done this is a philosophical and literary achievement of the first order. Those are the nice words out of the way. I just end by saying that Hegel anticipated Kierkegaard with his unhappy consciousness, but I will leave that there. I just couldn't refuse getting it in. As the actress said to the bishop. Anyway, where was I? Oh, yes. The end. Sorry for all the cock-ups. I should really do it again, but I don't know, I might do. Anyway, more Kierkegaard coming up soon.